So every talk, the sight, sounds, and feelings of music. Every talk begins with a slide about making sure that we're all on the same page about how important the topic is, and just really making a pitch of why we should all care about this. And I'm not very good at making slides. I don't understand how you communicate in a talk like this of like something that to us should be like an intrinsic truth of just how we feel about the music that we experience, right? Oh, the best I could say is that look at all these people who went to see Queen in 1986. Like this seems to be very important, I guess. I mean, like in psychology, we think a lot about like the costs that people overcome to gain certain things, and that would dictate the value that they construct around the thing that, again, they're overcoming costs for. There's a lot of costs associated with there. You probably had to buy a ticket. You probably had to like go and stand in this crowd and like shoulder to shoulder for 5-6 hours on end, facing the same direction. It can't have smelled good. And you're just watching these like few guys twirl around on stage for a few hours. I mean, like this seems to be very good and important. And I think I can make the pitch to you from a psychological perspective about the costs we overcome to achieve these things and how that must mean we value them. But I think we all have the intuition that music does seem to touch us in a very particular way. And it seems to activate a lot of our faculties that maybe are not getting accessed so readily by other things. And for as important as it seems to be, it's also extremely difficult to define for people who actually want to think about it. There's a lot of questions surrounding music about what exactly is this thing that we all can identify. We can all say what it is, and we can, like, if someone plays it for us, we can say that's it. Someone plays a car crash for us, and that's not music, right? But there's a lot of questions about what exactly are like the necessary ingredients to music. What do you have to put together in what combination to actually access what we would call music? Does anyone want to throw out like what's bottom line? You gotta have this to be music. This is the I draw the line at, and then throw out anything. Harmony, that's great. So pitches fitting together in a certain planned or constructed way. Okay, cool. Anybody else?
Maybe like a repeating rhythm. Repeating
rhythm, okay. Repetition and rhythm, harmony over those things. Okay, those are pretty good. I'd say those are like below that, you'd be running into just unorganized sound. But of course, that is basically the construct of when we think about when sound becomes music, right? Those rhythm, repetition, pitch, and changes in pitch, that feels about right. But of course, I'm speaking to you now and I'm changing my pitch. I'm using different rhythms at different points and trying to make that clear to you, right? Like there's a question about like when exactly pitch is not changing and that doesn't become music, right? Specifically, when is speech music? When is it not music to be talking to you like this? Like when there's a lot of questions we can ask that are really interesting to me about what are the like fine lines we draw between these things. So for instance, here's a good illusion.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible. But they sometimes behave so strangely. They sometimes behave so strangely. Sometimes behave so strangely. Sometimes behave so strangely.
You feel it?
Sometimes behave so strangely. Sometimes behave so strangely.
Right, okay. Now with that structure in mind.
The sounds as they appear to you are not only different from those that are really present, but they sometimes behave so strangely as to seem quite impossible.
Right, okay, that wasn't repetition that you just felt there, right? That was just, you had a structure in mind that had a certain expectation around it, that like turned something that was to you just a second ago, speech, just regular talking, into what to me feels like music, feels something emotive. Okay, here's another great example. There's been a lot of these different kinds of videos.
Well, you want to learn something?
Yes, I do.
What, you want me to teach you something? You want to learn something? All right, here's a useful lesson for you. Give up. Just quit. Because in this life, Yeah, you can try. But in the end, you're just gonna lose big time because the world is run by the man.
Who?
The man. Oh, you don't know the man? Oh, he's everywhere. In the White House, down the hall, Miss Mullins, she's the man. And the man ruined the ozone, and he's burning down the Amazon, and he kidnapped Shamu and put her in a chlorine tank, okay? And there used to be a way to stick it to the man. It was called rock and roll. But guess what? Oh, no. The man ruined that too with a little thing called MTV. So don't waste your time trying to make anything cool or pure or awesome, because the man's just going to call you a fat, washed-up loser and crush your soul. So do yourselves a favor and just give up. Oh.
So there's going to be all kinds of lessons today. One of them should be that School of Rock is the best movie for me. But I think the critical point to take from this is that, you know, changes in pitch, changes in rhythm. This is key to really our basic level communication with each other. And whether or not we call it music sometimes can get really hairy. But this seems like, I mean, from the example I've shown you, it seems like this is a really complicated question. And what science does best is sometimes work down and think about, well, what are we working with on a basic level here? What are the different kinds of things that we can change about sound, just at the most fundamental level, okay? Which would bring us to the question, what is sound exactly? Does anyone want to throw out their just now best example? I just have videos describing it. So anyone best example, what is sound? Let's do a video first. Let's go. Okay, so this is a cymbal filmed at a high rate, so you can watch in the slow motion, just like the cymbal we saw before, nothing different. That's making sound. That's this equals sound. Like this makes sound. Nothing else is going on. And what it looked like earlier, just like it being completely rigid against that drumstick. Right now, we can see just how much it's moving around. So, what is? Anyone want to take a guess of what is this doing that it's making sound? I'll do this right next to the time. Cameron, do you want to take a go?
It's making vibrations in the air.
Heck yeah, it's making vibrations in the air. So that's all it is. It's just transferring this motion into the air around it. We can look at how exactly that is being manipulated better with a guitar. So what a guitar does is that you strum it, it moves these strings. I should want to clarify that when you move the strings, it actually transfers those vibrations to the rest of the body, the wood of the guitar. That's acting a lot like the cymbal we just saw. It's vibrating like this, but we can actually look at the structure of those vibrations a lot easier on the strings. So we're gonna do that real quick. Regular guitar sound. How the pick works is that you come in with it. This is obviously in slow motion. You create tension in the string on the guitar. That tension eventually releases, and you create these waves within the string that are moving the air around the string in different ways at different times. Now, can anyone tell me what's going on differently between these strings? We'll play it again for me. What is the critical difference between what's happening on this string, what's happening on this string, what's happening on this string? So what's happening is that this string is moving, the wave on it is moving a lot slower. Ooh, wow, ooh, wow. Ooh, 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 ha, ooh, hoo-ha, 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 hee-ha, 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 right? They're moving at different rates. The only thing that's different between these strings that are making ba-da-da-da-da, making different tones is that they're just moving at these different rates. And that's really all that's happening with sound, is that it's different waves of pressurized air, just like the vibrations in air, perfect. Where you get moments of really high pressure where all the air, it's been squeezed together. The instrument has squeezed all the air together like this. And then moments of really low pressure where all the air has been taken out and it's been made into a really low pressure that's stretched down a long way. And what you get are just these waves of this happening. The only thing that changes along these waves and along different sounds is that you can have really quiet ones where the string didn't move that much and it didn't really move the air much of a lot, like this. Or you can have really loud ones where they're wah, 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 wah. Here's our amplitude here, right? That would be like if the wave just goes like this, 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 this. Or you can have really low pitches, ooh, or really high pitches, ooh, right? And that's just how often the air is moving back and forth, and how quickly, I should say. So when you get really high pitches, that air is just moving back and forth really, 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 really fast. That's the only thing that makes a high pitch different. And these are the two ways that sound can be different, really. At the end of the day is amplitude, how loud is it, and how high is it? Which is really cool, okay? But how would we sense that? How would you turn just like how quickly the air is moving in, let me be clear, microscopic quantities, like the tiniest fluctuations of air, and we change that into something really like incredibly like powerful to us, right? How does this air pressure changes and become actual electrical signals? I want to prime what there's the answer to this question with a thing called place coding, which is imagine just how a piano works. Right? I've shown you guitar, I've shown you cymbal. On a piano, it's really similar, except that every one place has one note. If I want to play, this is a C. If I want to play a C, I know exactly where to go to play it. You want a D flat, I know exactly where to go to play it. There's one place for one note. Doesn't matter how hard I hit, it's the same note, right? That's just to prime you for how the ear works, which is pretty incredible. So this is a very unfortunately dull video, but it's very good animation about how the ear is working. So it's just regular.
As sound enters the ear, it passes through the external auditory canal, where it meets the
okay, so you go into the
membrane.
eardrum. This is basically the reverse symbol.
The tympanic membrane then vibrates in response to the sound. Sounds of a lower pitch or frequency produce a slower rate of vibration, and sounds of lower volume or amplitude produce a less dramatic vibration. Higher frequency sounds produce faster vibrations. The tympanic membrane is cone-shaped and articulates with a chain of 3 bones called the auditory ossicles. The movements of the tympanic membrane vibrate the ossicles, passing on the information of frequency and amplitude.
So the frequency and amplitude, that's what we're talking about, how high or low it is and how loud or soft it is. And all we can really see what's happening is that we've got this symbol in our head that's like translating all of those movements onto these tiny, minuscule bones, smaller than the pinky thumbnail, tiny little things that are then registered. So this bone is connected right here to our inner ear.
The spiral portion of the bony labyrinth known as the cochlea. Vibrations produced by the stapes are drawn into the spiral system and return to meet the round window.
So now the only thing that's different is we've taken air vibrations. We've turned them into the symbol in our ear, that little piece of skin. That's turned it into bones. This is incredible. That's turned it into bone vibrations, okay? Those bone vibrations then are moving fluid within your inner ear. So now it's fluid vibrations, okay? This is all happening instantaneously. It's all mechanical. Okay, I'm gonna cut because it's boring. And we're looking at a cross section of those fluids.
Are visible. The membranes are flexible and move in response to the vibrations traveling up the scala vestibuli. The movements of the membranes then send vibrations back down to the scala tympani. A specialized structure called the organ of Corti is situated on the basilar membrane. As the basilar membrane vibrates, the organ of Corti is stimulated, which sends nerve impulses to the brain via the cochlear nerve.
Okay, so we had to get from vibrations in the air to electrical signals. We went vibrations in the air, skin flap, bone vibrations, fluid vibrations right here, fluid vibrations moving this membrane right here. That membrane then, this is pretty incredible. It's the only place in the brain that does this.
The actual nerve impulses are generated by specialized cells within the organ of Corti called hair cells. The hair cells are closely covered by a structure called the tectorial membrane. As the basilar membrane vibrates, the tiny clusters of hairs are bent against the tectorial membrane, triggering the hair cells to fire.
You see that? Everywhere else in the brain, if you want to turn anything into electrical signals, you've got to do a million chemical reactions. You've got to get a bunch of molecules to change their shape and they fit into different locks and keys differently. This, it's brilliant. Literally just bends a thing like this, which lets in ions, which sends electrical signals. That's why, for instance, if you ever try to follow a metronome just with your vision, or for instance, you look at car blinkers ahead of you in traffic and it seems like they line up for a second before they go out of sync again. That wouldn't happen if we could hear the car blinker because it's actually on such a fast time scale. Boop, 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 boop. It's just about whether or not that hair cell is getting bent. Anyway, I'm sorry, I get lost on that. This is really cool.
The entire basilar membrane does not vibrate simultaneously.
Okay, this is the place
Instead,
coding I was telling you about.
specific areas along the basilar membrane move variably in response to different frequencies of sound.
So this is the coil that was showing you where the fluid comes into the ear and then comes back out.
Lower frequencies vibrate the basilar membrane closer to the apex of the cochlea, whereas
Lower
higher
frequencies are lower
produce
notes.
vibrations closer to the base.
Higher frequencies are higher notes.
This arrangement is known as tonotopic organization.
You've literally got a reverse piano in your ear, if you uncoiled it, that is playing the piano for you from the things that are happening outside. You've got some cells that are only able to be moved by the higher frequencies, some cells that are only moving with the lower frequencies. Your brain, it's called, in the brain, we call it decoding. That your brain is like this computer algorithm that's like perfectly decoding all the sounds around it just by like orchestrating the like how malleable a certain tissue is in the brain. It's awesome. Okay, so obviously that's incredible. We're going to move to not the ear again. Okay, sound is cool. All right. I can get lost on that part, but that's where science starts, is like answering these like basic questions about what actually are we working with. We're working with air vibrations that change in pitch and in amplitude. They change in how high or low they are, and they change in how loud or quiet they are. That's pretty much what we're working with here. And so now we know how sound can get to electrical signals. That's cool. Okay, but how do electrical signals get to feelings? Like why would the different arrangements of pitch, amplitude, why would that have anything to do with my emotional life? Like there's a very good question there of why on earth would I endow that with any kind of meaning? And one of the first people to kind of, not one of the first people, but one of the people who probably is responsible for most every major academic input to music, because he made them so angry, is Steven Pinker, who's kind of he's a linguist at Harvard who's known for being a bit of a fart. And he said in his like 1996 or 7 book that I suspect music is auditory cheesecake, which is an exquisite confection crafted to tickle the sensitive spots of our mental faculties. Does anyone want to take a guess as to what Steven Pinker means by music is auditory cheesecake? I'll start by talking about it he's talking about it from an evolutionary perspective. So what he's saying basically is about cheesecake is that we, just like everything else in the world, are adapted to wanting the fats in nuts, the sugars from berries. It is very helpful to us, and we would survive better and evolve better by really liking those things. Now that we have access to all the nuts and berries we want, we really enjoy cheesecake, which is not adaptive. If all of everyone who ever lived only ate cheesecake, then we would not have gotten to where we are, right? But now that we have all the things that we've got people to like nuts and berries, we can hijack all of that material to like really enjoy this completely maladaptive thing, cheesecake. Does anyone what does he mean by auditory cheesecake then?
We do have a question in the chat.
Oh, cool, I didn't see.
So why do notes played on different instruments sound different, even though amplitude and pitch are the same?
That is the question, Roger. I wish I put that in. So this is what's so cool is that different notes on different instruments, the fundamental difference is in their overtone structure. So for instance, when you play a note on a trumpet, not only do you get a slightly different attack, right, than if on a oboe or anything else, but there's actually a super different structure of, do you get the first octave? Ooh, 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 ooh. How loud is this octave structure? How loud is the fifth above that? And it all relates to the physics of how these sound waves are actually, how frequent these sound waves are actually interacting with each other. So that's pretty much the basic answer as to why that's called timbre. How is timbre different? And there's a really good question in the brain of like, we can immediately identify different timbres of things. We can immediately pick apart those different sounds and recognize them pretty well. Like I know a Hendrix solo the second I hear it, even if I've never heard that Hendrix solo before, right? And there's something pretty interesting about the brain being able to pick that stuff apart, probably because we can know people's voices really, really well. And it's a really handy thing to be able to identify them super well. That's pretty much the answer, but I'd have to show you a few slides about the waves and their frequency rate and how they stack on top of each other and simple stuff. I guess there's also a cool thing. There's a great question of like, how do you hear multiple notes at once, right? You literally just add all of those vibrations together. And once you add them together, it's the ear that can pick apart, oh, this is happening here, and this is happening here, and this is happening here, even though it's only getting the one super complex wave, right? Okay, that's a whole other thing, but that's a great question. So what he's saying about what Steven Pinker is trying to say about auditory cheesecake is that language and us being able to literally communicate referential meaning to each other is critical. That's an incredibly adaptive thing to be able to do. We evolved to be able to have what he thinks are core modules that just the second a baby is born, the thing comes online that just like knows how to pick out language. And music is just some weird byproduct of like all this stuff that was built into language. And people who studied music really didn't like that take. And it birthed probably, like, again, the largest movement of people theorizing about the actual like fundamental structure of music and its relation to language ever. One of the better takes is musilanguage, so I'll be clear, Steven Pinker claims that music holds no adaptive purpose. You can't do anything with it. It's just riding on the coattails of language's glory. Whereas Stephen Brown, who wrote a paper about musilanguage, claims music and language have always been opposing sides of the same spectrum. and evolve together as a musical language because they're both useful. So for instance, if you think of music and language, both they take discrete pitches or phonemes that combine in different ways to mean different things, then they exist really on the same spectrum where language is sound as referential meaning. I can say, oh my God, that bear over there is going to kill me. I can communicate that to someone, and that's a very good, useful, adaptive thing to communicate. Whereas sound as a music might just be sound as emotive meaning. It can just, the way that, and that's specific to like the way that pitch changes. Those pitch changes are musically meaning phrases to us that like actively activate our emotions. The claim being, I don't really need to say, oh my God, that bear over there is going to kill me. If I go, like if I can like emotively tell someone to look somewhere and that something bad is going to happen, that does most of the job of like really what language is setting out to do. And it evolves pretty quickly. One of the major proponents, or I should say one of the major lines of evidence of this is called motherese, which basically just starts with the question, how do you talk to babies? Does anyone want to give an example of how they might talk to a baby? It's a little embarrassing, but I've been embarrassing myself the whole time, but I can, like we all know how we talk to babies, which with nonsense words and just like just changing our pitch a whole lot to mean different things. Okay, this is how everyone talks to babies. And I don't mean like, oh yeah, like everyone talks. This is how everyone talks to babies, like across the entire world, tonal language or not. Like this is how every single culture communicates with babies who don't have any language. And it's like kind of weird enough that people are thinking like, this is probably how we were all talking to each other. Like before we actually got to like being able to put together he means like that. And like a notebook case means this. Like before we got to like literal referential meaning, we were all just talking to each other about our emotions and about like what things meant to us. And that was getting a lot of the job done. Therefore, music is not riding on coattails of language's glory. It is actively embedded, as I think we've seen with all the drumming and all the stuff, that into how we are communicating with each other. I'm over time. So why would pitch and amplitude be related to emotionality? That's a great question. Why would pitch and amplitude be related to emotionality? These are our body's natural responses to things. If I'm stressed out, my body naturally tightens all of my muscles so that I'm ready to run. It tightens the vocal cords too, which go, which automatically changes the pitch. If you're really sad, your body's trying to conserve energy. And so it lets you talk like this. And we figured out eventually how to manipulate these things so that we could signal them to each other because they're communicative. But they were just embedded into how bodies were responding to situations in general. This is launched into a much larger topic of our emotions just performances of themselves to each other, right? The body has adaptive ways of responding to situations. The critical one in the evidence being fear, right? If you're very afraid and you don't know what's around you, you would widen your eyes and look around so that you had all the information you needed, okay? We can exaggerate those changes to signal our emotions to each other. There's nothing really adaptive about going, like there's nothing that gets us out of a situation or it solves anything by just going to each other and going, but we can exaggerate the natural fear emotions in the fear of expressions in ourselves to communicate that to each other, which is adaptive. We do adapt to each other, right? So if I could go like this, then I have someone on my team who knows something bad is going on and we can figure it out together. Music follows this tradition by giving structure and mutual participation to that, again, the expression of those naturally emotional information. If my voice naturally changes pitch when I'm stressed out, if it naturally gets quiet and low when I'm sad, then that I can manipulate that and turn that into what is music, which is automatically communicating that emotion to people. Okay, what on earth is the takeaway from that? Okay, so you are superheroes for being able to sense the world at all. I think that's a critical point. That like the difference between you and like a Marvel character is pretty much zilch when you consider that you can like actively decode sound in the world or sight or any of Sound waves of perception vary in pitch and amplitude. Emotional communication varies in pitch and amplitude, right? Whereas this variety naturally occurs via the body's responses to given situations, we can also perform them as signals to each other, right? So as to adapt to each other and as to actively like share meaningful information with each other. All right, I think that's it. Any question? I should put questions. I always try to put, I'm bad at the beginning and the end of talk, but I should put a questions. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. This was such a great talk.
It was so interesting.
Yeah.
thank you.
mind-blowing.
It's fun.
I can start
It's super fun. Any excuse to look at just like those slow motion videos too is always a treat.
Yeah, really cool. I was thinking about I guess that's also called the eardrum, that sheet membrane. So when that gets damaged by like a really loud sound, like what does that look? Does that look like a tear in like the middle of that membrane?
You know, I don't know if the eardrum, that membrane, gets damaged
Or if it's like
nearly as readily as like the cochlea. Like I think it's like the inner ear where all that fluid is, that like hair cells are really difficult to maintain. So for instance, like blasting music on them all the time will like erode those hair cells just because they're being bent around too much really easily. I don't know exactly what happens within that eardrum when there is, of course, like Q-tip stuff, right? You can imagine that there's plenty of torn eardrums in the world. But I do know that like for instance, like cochlear implants, which are like the most restorative like hearing thing we have, that pretty much just like acts as the eardrum for you and like stimulates the cochlea, the spiral where you need it.
Very cool.
Yeah.
I feel like from your talk, I had these like two weird thoughts that are completely unrelated. But the first one would be, we don't think of we think of music now as just like emotional, but it also, I guess maybe evolutionarily, if you're trying to like group a lot of people to do something together, and you just think of like a beating drum, it's very now easy to get 100 people to be doing the same exact task, in unison with this like beating drum, whether it's like on a ship or something. So that's it's cool to think about that.
1,000%. Yeah. So that's there's a cool theory of, I mean, I don't know exactly what it's a theory of, but it's an idea that whereas other animals evolved around their environment. So for instance, you put a finch on one island and then another finch on another island, and you're going to get different beak sizes. They're going to have to like physically adapt to the things that they have around them. We don't do that. We went everywhere. And we never changed really what like we looked like. And the one idea is that because we adapted to each other. Like we didn't necessarily adapt to our environment because our environment was always in groups and with each other. And music has a particular skill of like letting us participate in like an emotion at the same time. So whereas like otherwise we would like just be like one by one communicating like an emotion to each other, music allows us to like give that enough structure so that we can simultaneously like build that around each other and therefore feel stronger, right, in a group than otherwise. Yeah, that's a great point.
And we have a question in the chat. Let's see. So Roger says the brains of different people interpret sounds differently. Pleasant or unpleasant, thrilling or soothing, energizing or soporific. I prefer quiet to loud. My daughter prefers loud to quiet. Beatles or Mozart. So why?
Right. Yeah, heck yeah. So that kind of links back to the first example I showed of the speech that you listen to a bunch of times until it becomes like rhythmic and you hear like the pitch changing over and over again, it becomes musical. And then when you listen to the speech again, all of a sudden it's a woman talking, and then it's a woman singing in rhythm, and then it's a woman talking again. And what that's kind of meant to show is that we build structures in our mind that like completely transform the world around us according to what we are coming in with. we are a dynamical system with the world around us that, you know, there is no, we bring all our preferences and all of our beliefs and all of our memories into a situation. That's what dictates what we take away from it. This is, just from a pragmatic perspective, you're picking up on something that makes studying music in the brain really hard, is that everyone is coming in with these different emotional responses to different music. And so it's really difficult to know, as a scientist, how do you control for anything? Do you want everyone listening to the same piece of Mozart and then you have a ground truth of what they're actually listening to? Or do you want everyone to bring in, I want you to bring in whatever music gives you chills. And it could be the vocal solo on Dark Side of the Moon. It could be anything. And I just want to see what happens when chills happens, regardless of what the actual musical ground truth is. There's a lot of that's been a huge issue in how people actually measure it. Yeah. That was an awesome question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Speaking of that, I would love to hear your thoughts on music therapy, because I know they've been working on music therapy developments with Alzheimer patients, where sort of retrieving memories or emotions.
Yeah, that seems like the most impressive use of it so far, and seems to be having the most impact. So for instance, I haven't seen this movie in forever, but because it's an emotional roller coaster, but the movie Alive Inside that came out in I think 2011 or 12, it's basically just like an hour and a half of video interviews with people who are close to non-responsive until they get played music, just like off an iPod shuffle. It's like a $30 intervention to and then the second they listen to any music from, about 13, when they're 13 to 15, they start talking again. They start recalling specific things that happened to them. They can start interacting with people that they didn't know who they were a few moments ago. There's something really incredible about how music gets embedded into our neural system, that once it gets reactivated in a really strong way, all of a sudden, all of these things that you couldn't access start to open up. And there's actually someone, Nick Kathios, was an undergrad here and is now going to, I believe, a PhD at Northeastern in a music lab. And then Paul Bloom, who is at the psych department, who was a Juilliard pianist before he came to psychology. They're doing a really amazing, I think one of the first really heavily controlled memory studies in music and aging. So their intervention is essentially to just play, either you play people music that they listened to when they were young, you play music that's very similar sonically to music that they listened to when they were young, but they didn't actually listen to, or there's no intervention, and just see how fluidly can they talk about their life and what is a very typical memory experiment. And I don't think they have results yet. I don't think we have memory results yet, but it's going to be. There's no way it's not going to be really cool, because it's such an easy intervention. I should say that in Alive Inside, they're I think there's one woman who pretty much all she does is play piano all day, and then that's the only time, that's when she feels put together still, is when she's actually going through that. So there's something about, embodied cognition is a huge part of this too, where everything that we know about the world is rooted through what we know about our body and how we perceive our body. And music seems to access that quite well, because that's how we engage with it, right? It's all, music is embodied. There's no other way to access it. So anyway, I'm ranting. Roger?
Yeah, I'm wondering if the sounds which I perceive are pleasant. I'm sorry, I'm not quite explaining myself. I'm thinking about different people perceiving different sounds as being pleasant or unpleasant. And I'm thinking that even if the sound is actually different, whether it actually triggers the same sort of electrical responses in the brain, and so that everybody's brain responses for pleasant are the same as everybody else's brain responses for unpleasant, despite the fact that the sound and the amplitude and the timbre are all different? Do you understand?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So I will say that there hasn't been enough research on music. I actually, in the scanner, like the fMRI scanner that we actively use, one big obstacle is that the scanner is really loud and like actively going like chong 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 like the whole time. So it's pretty hard to actually do like a pretty well controlled music study. That's one obstacle. But the what I can say is that like scientists have shown using fMRI, which is the big brain scanner, I think for about a decade now, that you can categorize people's brain responses across people based on their emotions. So you can just, I think just by literally asking them like, are you happy? Are you sad? Are you angry? Given different stimuli that you've shown them, and you can categorize their brain responses based on how are they're feeling. So there is some, evidence that we have access to that those patterns of activity around the brain do look really similar across people when they're calling it the same thing. So I don't know if there's evidence for that in music, but I mean, because it's more difficult to control than, for instance, I can show you everyone reacts the same way to a picture of a baby smiling. Everyone reacts the same way to a picture of a big spider. Everyone reacts the same way to a big, like there's certain situations I can put you in that everyone's going to react the same. And so I can categorize them much better than with music. I have to just rely on how you're saying you feel, right? It's very different. But thanks, that's an awesome question.
Yeah, that was a really good question. And it actually made me think of like horror movie music, like that's really dissonant. Have we evolved to fear dissonance like evolutionarily? And why? Is it like something that insects in the forest that we were evolved to fear back in the day?
So what I'll say is that harmony and consonance is relatively naturally occurring because of the overtone series. So for instance, this how we discovered the major scales, do 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 do. How we discovered that was that monks were singing tones in these large caverns, woo, ah, this drone music, ah. And then because of the overtone series, the next note that comes out is the octave, woo, woo, woo. And then like it sounded like the gods were singing the octave back, right? It sounds like, because it's just resonating out of this chapel in a different way. So ooh is coming back at that. And then the next note in the overtone series, which is again is just related to the math of how these waves stack up against each other, is the fifth. Ooh, doo, 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 doo. That one came next. And so they're like, oh, that's the next note. Okay. And then it literally just occurred like that until they had all these notes that were happening constantly that were naturally occurring. That there's a certain mathematical beauty to their, or symmetry maybe, to how they fit together. Dissonance is, relatively unnaturally occurring. You could imagine that extremely emotional moments would be moments of dissonance. Like that's like anything that like you stress the vocal system out, it's going to like flutter between a lot of notes. That's a terrible, unpleasant sound, and that's like only occurring when something is dying near you or when like something's being hunted, like that. So in a way, it's definitely ringing on that, on those coattails in a way. Another thing I was going to say though is that, like, getting back to Roger's initial question of then why is dissonance pleasant to some people, right? You can, for me, dissonance is really interesting because as a music major, you get into really bizarre music that's people telling like certain truths that are hard to hear, but that are really beautiful in a way. And you have to like train yourself to like, again, have the structures of mind that can take those sounds and that can perceive them as beautiful. For instance, Coltrane is a great has a great album at the end of his life where it's just him and a drummer, and Coltrane's a jazz saxophonist player, and he had pretty much lost his mind, and it's maybe like an hour of just him going and like once you build up the structures of mind that can like interpret what someone's trying to say with that, it becomes really profound. And of course, without it, it just sounds like noise. So anyway, I'll to link those 2 points that I think are important.
Well, thank you. Does anyone else have any
Rock and
more
roll.
before we wrap up? Well, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thanks for having me. It's been lovely.
This is fantastic and really cool. Yeah, good luck with all your research. Yeah, thank you so much. This is fantastic. And really, really cool to think about the internal keyboard that we have. That's still blowing my mind.
I know, isn't that cool? So there was another theory for a while that it was, I should stop. There was another theory for a while that it was actually the rate of firing in the neuron was what was signaling the frequency. Mm-hmm. And a bunch of really clever experiments found that actually like the tonotopic organization gets you all the way there. But it's a really cool, it's a really cool idea.
Wow.
For sure.
Well, thank you
awesome.
so much
for
joining us on
Lovely
a Saturday. Enjoy the rest of your weekend and reach out anytime. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy these sessions.
Goodbye. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you all.